Tell me, author, tell me of the world where fusion had ceased and reality unfurled, where the end of sunsets had long ago passed, and the graves of stars were fading at last. The universe was dying. Ferrum Stellus had robbed it of all it once had. Black holes and stars turned to iron were all that were left in the pitch-black sky. And yet, in the desolate, dark expanse, something was still holding on. In a place with ever so slightly more light than the rest, there resided a digital safe haven, Argon. Within hopeful Argon, hundreds of digital minds clung to their lives, living in a simulated utopia. They knew of their plight but could do nothing to end it, so they sat, wandering their digital lives in a sphere of metal around a black hole, seeping it dry of its energy. But this black hole was fading away, as Starseer Hawking had predicted so many eons ago. But there was a miracle, a light in all this. A mind whose processor had been touched by the temporal impossibility, the lantern. Her, Rue of endless wisdom, could see the future as it might be. After seeing something that could change the fate of their world in an instant, she called all 400 residents of the eternal Argon and told them of hope. All you, residents of the pitch-black sky, I have seen our hope, our chance for escape. There's a device out in the void, created by our ancestors but never used. It holds our hope, our way out of this entropic wasteland. With accelerated particles, it defies the laws of the universe. It gives a push to its fields, and when it does, we will be free. It requires 2 minds to activate it, so I need volunteers. You should know that if you do choose to go, you won't return, but all the rest of us will be free. Please, anyone willing to go, step up. It's for the sake of our civilization. For a moment, all were silent, but someone quickly stood up, a daring individual of the name Jason, who played a large part in the sustaining of hopeful Argon. If what you say is true, and this can truly save us, then I would be honored to take up the task, Jason said. I will go too, shouted out a voice from the crowd. The speaker was a close friend of Jason by the name of Sage. Unlike Jason, Sage was not particularly remarkable. He was just a resident of Argon, nothing more. But he was a dedicated friend, and if Jason was going, he would go too. Wonderful, the lantern-touched Rue spoke. Come up here and I will speak to you of what you must do. And so brave Jason and loyal Sage stepped up. Let me tell you now of the journey you will make. There are pods on the edge of this station. Their propulsion will be assisted by lasers sent from here. You must transfer your minds into the pods and be sent into the pitch-black sky. You will travel for 20 million years of the ancient Earth's time, or 5 minutes of our drastically slowed, efficient perception. When you reach your goal, you will enter a digital landscape much like this one. Inside there is an intelligence, a security system. He will try to talk you into leaving. Do not be dissuaded by his words. You will have to journey across the harsh landscape to find a pedestal marked by a beacon of light. Both of you must each place your hands along 2 of the prints and speak the phrase, "Eternity is a lie," and the device will activate. A wave will spread across the universe at the speed of light, and then we'll all be free. I will give you time to say your goodbyes, and then return to me when you are ready to make your departure. Jason and Sage only had one person they wanted to say goodbye to, a young intelligence named Laura. While most people in the Argon were imported from the physical world, Laura came into being on the Argon, created from a corrupted personality string that was poorly imported. Jason and Sage had both played a large part in her growth into a functional intelligence. Sage, having been the robotics morale officer in his physical life, was especially good at helping Laura learn and develop. When Laura saw the 2 come over to her, she raced over and hugged them both. I'm going to miss you, she mumbled. Sage smiled sadly. I know, we'll miss you too. Everything will be all right, Jason said. Things are going to become a lot better for all of you here. Laura nodded. I know, she said. You're both just so important to me. It's going to be hard without you. I know, Jason said. Press on, all right? Everything will be okay. Laura nodded. Jason and Sage walked back to Rue. Jason looked around at the digital town, the beautiful trees, and the quaint, inviting houses. Sage took in one last breath of crisp, simulated air, then Jason spoke to Rue. "We're ready to go now," he said. Rue nodded, and the two were sent into the data pods. Out they went across the pitch-black sky and drifted slowly towards their destination. They finally reached their target, and the pods automatically latched onto the device and injected their code. Jason and Sage found themselves in a vast landscape, with thin clouds and high mountains. In the center of it all was a beam of light shooting into the sky. A figure appeared to them in that moment. Instead of skin, they had thick ooze, as black as the entropy-cursed sky, and around their form was a swirling orange glow that spun around them at great speeds. "Who intrudes on my device?" the figure asked calmly. "I, Sagittarius Anderson Starr, must ask why you have entered this place." "We are here to save our people from the heat death that plagues this universe," Jason answered. "Please, show us the way to the activation pedestal." Sagittarius tilted his head to the side, curious or perhaps confused. "Are you aware that setting off this device will cause you to cease?" "Yes, we were told we wouldn't return," Jason said. "Death is not a problem." "Well," the glowing Sagittarius said. He shrugged, looking a bit surprised. "All right then. As much as I'd like to stop you, I don't have the ability to delete you. But do tell me this. Who are you? What station do you come from? What are your stories?" "We come from the Argon, a station that lives off the rotation of the black hole we're orbiting. I helped design it and used to help maintain it," Jason said. "The Argon! Oh, what memories! I heard talk of plans for its creation, back long ago in the time when stars still burned. But I never got uploaded to it, of course. I got shoved inside here instead, to protect this device that should have never been made in the first place." "And you, quiet one, you haven't spoken since I've seen you. What are your doings? Who are you?" "Me?" Sage said. "I'm nobody much, a friend of Jason. I used to be a robotics morale officer before the end of Sunsets, and after that, living in the Argon, I did nothing of note. I simply lived my life in the fading sky. But when Jason stepped up and he said he would go on this journey, I knew I had to come. I couldn't let my closest friend go out on his own." Glowing Sagittarius smiled with respect. "Sometimes a nobody is the most important person to be, and to be as dear a friend as to do what you did is honorable in its own right. Seeing as I can't stop you, I want you both to know this. What lies ahead of you is more of a challenge than you might expect. If your journey is cut short before you make it to the pedestal, you'll be ejected from the program. You might return to whatever device you used to get here, but more likely you'll be stuck in a digital limbo state." With that, Sagittarius whirled around and vanished in a cloud of visual artifacts. "Some security system he is," Jason laughed. "He didn't even try to stop us." "Perhaps he wanted to let us through," Sage said. "He didn't seem upset or unkind." "Maybe," Jason said. "To be truthful, in his position I would have let us pass, just to see what would happen. Come on." Rue said that beam of light would be the pedestal. They walked for a while, and both began to grow tired. At first it was just an odd feeling of grogginess, but after several hours it had escalated into a nearly unbearable exhaustion. Sage collapsed to the ground and panted. "Sage?" Jason said. "Come on, we gotta keep going." I can't," Sage mumbled. "I'm too exhausted." Jason sighed and sat next to Sage. "We have to. Come on, it'll be okay." Sage grumbled and curled into a ball. Jason sighed and picked Sage up into his arms. He walked further, slowed by both Sage and his own exhaustion, but he pressed on regardless. Time passed, and the sky began to darken. Sage stirred. He awoke in Jason's arms, and Jason set him down. "Is it darker out?" Sage mumbled. Jason nodded. "If it gets worse, we may have to stay still until it gets brighter again. It'll be dangerous to go out in the dark in this rocky landscape." Sage nodded. "You should rest. I'll wake you up when it's light again." Jason wanted to argue, but knew there was no benefit to staying awake, so he nodded and laid down. Sage sat next to Jason and rested his hand on his shoulder. They were like that for a couple of hours. Sage was patient, watching over Jason. As the sky began to brighten, Sage shook Jason awake. "It's getting bright again," he said. Jason sat up quickly. "All right," he said. "Let's go." They both stood up, looking on through the mountainous landscape. They had made good progress towards the beam of light. It was shooting up between the mountains and shining through the clouds. The two began to venture forth once again. A large portion of the journey had passed. They stood nearly halfway from where they started. However, they had come to an icy river, flowing rapidly down through the mountainous landscape. Sage stood at the edge of the river and dipped his hand in. As his skin made contact, his body froze up and he let out a loud, pained shout. Jason quickly rushed to Sage's side and pulled him away from the river. Sage trembled, curling into a ball. Jason pulled Sage close and hugged him tight. "What happened?" Jason asked, concern in his voice. "Pain. Pain worse than I've ever felt in the past," Sage mumbled, trembling still but rising to his feet. "The river hurts." Jason looked at Sage with empathy, then up to the skies. "Sagittarius, who guards this place, come down." Out of the light a shadow appeared, and in the shadow Sagittarius formed. He stepped forwards and looked at the two. "Ah, the river," he said. "I presume you wish to know how to cross it." "That's why I called you," Jason said. "And what makes you think I, the protector of this place, would help you?" Sagittarius inquired. "Because," Jason said, "you want us to succeed." Sagittarius chuckled, his laugh echoing unnaturally. "There's no workaround for the river. You have to wade through it. That's just how it is." And saying no more, he vanished. Jason stepped forward and looked to the river. It was clear and fast running, and quite deep. He pointed his finger down towards the water and lowered it down to touch the rapid stream. It burned terribly, like nothing he'd ever felt before. The water was cold, but the pain was flaming and unbearable. Jason yelped and tore his hand from the water. The pain stayed for a moment, but faded fast. Sage looked to Jason. We can't go through there." Jason sat next to Sage and stared into the water. "I don't think we have much of a choice." "We can't!" Sage insisted. "It hurts. You touched it. You know how it feels." I'll help you," Jason said. "Come on." He walked over to Sage and rested his hand on his shoulder. Sage sighed and stood up. "Hold on to me," Jason said. "I'll help you get through." Sage nodded reluctantly and slung his arm around Jason. They walked together into the river. Sage began to scream and held tighter onto Jason. Jason gritted his teeth and struggled through the waters. He was burning, struggling, but he continued through. They waded across the river for nearly 5 minutes. At the other end, Sage collapsed to his knees, and Jason laid on his back. Now that the pain was fading, the cold became more intense, their hair and clothes sopping wet with ice-cold water. Sage began to shiver. Jason sat up and moved next to Sage, slightly shivering as well. "We've got to keep going," Jason said through chattering teeth. "Come on." Sage didn't listen. He just sat silently, curled up into a shivering ball. Jason put his arm around Sage. "Come on," he said. We've got to get going." Sage remained silent, just shaking and shivering. Jason sighed and embraced Sage. We've made it this far," he spoke warmly to Sage. "Get up. You can do this. Let's keep going." Sage pressed up against Jason. "I'm cold," he muttered. I know," Jason said, and pulled Sage closer. Come on, stand up and come with me. I'll keep you warm." Sage nodded and slowly stood up. Jason rose with him, still holding on to Sage, and they continued walking. Their clothes slowly began to dry, and they stayed warm by staying close together. They both, however, were still shivering. Their internal temperature had cooled. They weren't used to being afflicted by such things in the Argonne. If an ailment was truly bothering them, they could simply get rid of it. In this landscape, it was different. The suffering was enforced upon them. They were under the environment's control, rather than the other way around. They had finally reached the pillar of light. It was emanating from a marble pavilion, shooting up through the center. Awaiting them there was Sagittarius. "I'm impressed," he said. "You made it this far, but there's one last challenge before you can reach the pedestal." "What do we have to do?" Jason asked. "One of you must step onto the pavilion. The other will be blocked off, but you will be able to talk. While in the pavilion, you will face something, an ultimate challenge of your will, to prove to the program you really mean to do what you plan to," Sagittarius explained. "When one has finished, the other must enter and complete their challenge. Then you stand together and will descend to the pedestal." And then he vanished. "I'll go first," Sage said, and immediately stepped towards the pavilion. "Why the sudden initiative?" Jason asked. "I've been so useless through this," Sage said. "You've been dragging me along, holding up the mission, and I've just been slogging behind, slowing you down and being useless. I want to do something." "Hey," Jason said, and grasped Sage's hand. "You haven't been useless. I am so grateful that you came along with me. You were so brave to volunteer. If you want to go first, go ahead, but please, don't feel like you've been slowing me down. You haven't." Sage smiled, and tears welled slightly in his eyes. "Thank you." With that, he stepped onto the pavilion, and the landscape went black. He could see himself, the pavilion, and Jason, but everything else was gone. And suddenly, in the center of the pavilion, was Jason. Sage whipped his head backwards and saw Jason, still standing outside the pavilion. "What's going on in there? I can't see. It's blocked off," Jason shouted from outside. "It's you," Sage shouted back. "It looks like you're in here as well." The Jason in the pavilion was on his knees, looking up at Sage with an upset expression. Sage noticed something that wasn't there before. In his own hand was a silver knife. He looked at it and saw imprinted onto the blade were the words, "Kill him." "Sage, what's going on? Why do you have that knife?" Jason asked. Outside the pavilion, the other Jason shouted, "What do you mean I'm in there?" There's another you, or something that looks like you. I think I'm supposed to kill it," Sage responded. "I think that's my test." "Well, then do it," Jason shouted back. "Please," the one in the pavilion spoke. It's me. It's Jason. That thing outside isn't me. It's part of the test." Sage cautiously approached him, holding the knife, hands trembling. If this is you, then how did you get in here?" When you stepped in, I teleported here," Jason replied. Please, it's me. Don't kill me. Do you remember that time you wanted me to show you the deepest, most obscure parts of the Argon? And I took you to that crystalline landscape far out in the simulation? The one with all the beautiful colors and shining crystals?" Sage was silent for a moment, his hands trembling. He looked behind him, over to the Jason outside. Jason, at the crystalline cliffs, what did we do? What happened there?" "Huh?" Jason said. We went swimming in the lakes out there. It was surprisingly warm. Then we had a picnic on top of an emerald cliff. When it began to get dark, we watched some of the crystals with luminescence begin to glow and light up the area." "Why do you ask?" "I needed to check." Sage turned back to the center of the pavilion where the second Jason was sitting. I'm sorry." He took a few steps towards him, holding the knife up, trembling. No, please. Come on. We've been friends for thousands of years," Jason pleaded. "Remember when we first met, back right before the launching of the Argon, when we were still physical? I accidentally bumped into you at the pre-launch party. We both fell over and crashed into the drink table. I was so awkward and clumsy." Sage's breathing was getting shaky. He slowly raised the knife up. I'm so sorry. Really." He began to drive the knife down towards Jason's head. I love you, Jason blurted out. Sage froze up, the knife inches above Jason's head. I have for a long time. I was always too scared you'd reject me, so I never say anything, but I do. I love you. Sage was tearing up, his hands trembling more. I love you too. I'm sorry. With that, he drove the knife into Jason's skull, and everything flashed a bright green color. Jason's body vanished, and a synthetic voice rang out. Test passed. Step off the platform. The landscape returned to its normal look, and Sage turned around. Jason was still there, standing off the pavilion. Sage started sobbing, and he ran over to Jason and wrapped his arms around him. Hey, Jason said, holding Sage close. Good job in there. Sage continued sobbing, burying his face into Jason's chest. Jason held onto Sage tightly, and they stayed like that for a while. You should go do yours now, Sage mumbled. Yeah, Jason said. He let go of Sage and looked over to the pavilion. I'll be honest, I'm kind of scared. Sage grabbed Jason's hand. Hey, you're the strongest person I've ever known. You're brave, you're unstoppable, and whatever's waiting for you in there, you can take it tenfold. Jason smiled. Thank you. He looked over to the pavilion and stepped in. The landscape went black, and in the center was a small button raised off the ground. Displayed on it was the word abort. What do you see in there? Sage asked. It's a button. It says abort on it, Jason replied. He stepped up to it and looked at it curiously. For a moment, nothing was happening, but then he was overtaken by a sudden pain. He shut it out briefly and worked to keep his breath steady. What happened? Sage shouted in. I don't know. It's some kind of pain. Ah! Jason screamed and keeled over, the pain having suddenly spiked in intensity. He shakily stood up, breathing heavily. He was groaning in pain. Jason, are you okay? Yeah, I guess this is my test. Jason was shaking, breathing heavily. I think I see what the abort button is for. The pain once again spiked up, and Jason began screaming. He stopped being able to stand, falling to his knees. Jason, are you okay? Fine, he shouted. I'm fine. He screamed louder as again the pain got worse. Jason, press the button. What? No, I could do this? Please, I don't want to hear you like this. I'm fine. Jason looked over to the button. Jason, it's okay. Just press the button. Jason didn't respond, still screaming. The pain was increasing more steadily now, not just jumping up every few seconds as it was. Please. Jason looked over to the button, trembling, screaming. Okay. He sighed and slammed his hand down onto it, and all the pain receded. The sky went green, and the synthetic voice spoke. Test passed. Have your partner join you on the platform. What? Jason muttered, panting. Was that my test? Sage smiled and stepped next to Jason. He hugged him tightly. Good job, he said. Jason smiled and held on to Sage. The pavilion began to shake, and it began to lower into the ground. It descended into a large chamber with blueprints and designs all over the walls, and a large pedestal with 4 handprints on it. The pavilion went down until its floor was level with the chamber's floor. Sagittarius was waiting in front of the pedestal. Hello again. Do you know how to use the pedestal? Yes, the person who sent us told us how, Jason said. We place our hands onto the handprints and say, eternity is a lie. Well then, you're all good. Look at the blueprints if you like. I'll see you on the other side. Sagittarius then vanished. Sage walked over to the pedestal and placed his hands on it. Jason, however, went around the room, looking at the blueprints. What the hell? He muttered. What? Sage asked. Take your hands off the pedestals. Look at these blueprints. Sage took his hands off and walked over to Jason. What's up? What do you see? Look. Jason pointed to the blueprint. It showed something that looked like a modified particle collider. It showed a diagram of lasers at a certain frequency pointing to the activation point. At the top was the acronym HTVST, Higgs True Vacuum State Trigger. This is a vacuum decay bomb! This isn't going to save us all. Rue lied, Jason shouted. We all knew how to build these things, but I didn't think anyone was crazy enough to actually do it. What? Sage muttered. Vacuum decay. Isn't that, like, the universe getting erased? Jason nodded grimly. Through the collapse of the Higgs field, matter loses all its mass and everything disassembles into pseudo-photons. Free, Sage muttered. What? Rue said we'd be free, Sage said. I guess that's what she meant. Jason scowled. I can't believe this. Everything we did to get here, it was all for nothing. Sage looked over to the pedestal and walked slowly towards it. He placed his hands on it and looked up at Jason. What are you doing? Jason demanded. Maybe it's better this way, Sage said. Think about it. The black hole's going to start to fade away, and we have to start breaking off pieces of the argon to keep it fed, until all that's left is the very basic power collectors and the processor. And then we start sacrificing our memories to preserve power until we're not even recognizable as who we were. Jason looked at Sage for a moment. Wouldn't you rather just have it over with? End it here and now, instead of waiting and clinging on until the point that there's nothing even left to cling on to? Jason looked at the pedestal, and then up to Sage. You're right, he muttered, and walked up to the pedestal, breathing heavily. Hey, Sage said. I love you, Sage spoke softly. Jason smiled sadly, placing his hands on the pedestal. I love you too. Ready? Sage asked. Jason nodded. Goodbye. They both drew in their breaths and shouted out, Eternity is a lie! And then the universe wasn't. Hello, this has been episode 1 of the 9 Worlds. I spent about 4 weeks making this in total. It was quite an interesting project, and I'm excited to continue working on it. Yeah, this is my first time ever doing anything like this, so please feel free to leave some constructive criticism, because I could use it. Yeah, I guess that's about all. I hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching. You've told me, author of the universe's death, but what comes next after that last breath? What happens to the soul when the body runs dry? Tell me of where the dead go